Welcome to the Ickabog, video 13, chapter 34, 3 More Feet. This had better be worth my while, snapped Spittleworth 5 minutes later, as he entered the blue parlor where the spy was waiting. Your lordship, said the breathless man, they're saying the monster's hopping. They're saying what? Hopping, my lord, hopping, he panted. They've noticed all the prints are made by the same left foot. Spittleworth stood speechless. Pardon me. It had never occurred to him that the common folk might be clever enough to spot a thing like that. Indeed, he who'd never had to look after a living creature in his life, not even his own horse, hadn't stopped to consider the fact that a creature's feet might not all make the same prints in the ground. Must I think of everything, bellowed Spittleworth. And he stormed out of the parlor and off to the guard's room, where he found Major Roach drinking wine and playing cards with some friends. The major leaped to his feet at the sight of Spittleworth, who beckoned him to come outside. I want you to assemble the Ickabog Defense Brigade immediately, Roach, Spittleworth told the major in a low voice. You're to ride north, and be sure to make plenty of noise as you go. I want everyone from Chauville to Jeroboam to see you passing by. Then, once you're up there, spread out and mount a guard over the border of the marsh. But, began Roach, who'd gotten used to a life of ease and plenty at the palace, with occasional rides around Chauville in full uniform. I don't want butts, I want action, shouted Spittleworth. Rumors are flying that there's nobody stationed in the north. Go now, and make sure you wake up as many people as possible as you go. But leave me 2 men, Roach, just 2. I have another small job for them. So the grumpy Roach ran off to assemble his troops, and Spittleworth proceeded alone to the dungeons. The first thing you heard when he got there was the sound of Mr. Dovetail, who was still singing the national anthem. Be quiet, bellowed Spittleworth, drawing his sword and gesturing to the warder to let him into Mr. Dovetail's cell. The carpenter appeared quite different to the last time Lord Spittleworth had seen him. Since learning that he wasn't to be let out of the dungeon to see Daisy, a wild look had appeared in Mr. Dovetail's eyes. Of course, he hadn't been able to shave for weeks either, and his hair had grown rather long. I said be quiet, barked Spittleworth, because the carpenter, who didn't seem to help himself, was still humming the national anthem. I need another 3 feet. Do you hear me? 1 more left foot and 2 right. Do you understand me, carpenter? Mr. Dovetail stopped humming. If I carve them, will you let me out to see my daughter, my lord? He asked in a hoarse voice. Spittleworth smiled. It was clear to him that the man was going slowly mad, because only a madman would imagine he'd be let out after making another 3 Ickabog feet. Of course I will, said Spittleworth. I shall have the wood delivered to you first thing tomorrow morning. Work hard, carpenter. When you're finished, I'll let you out to see your daughter. When Spittleworth emerged from the dungeons, he found 2 soldiers waiting for him, just as he had requested. Spittleworth led these men up to his private apartments, made sure Cankerby the footman wasn't skulking about, locked the door, and turned to give the men their instructions. There will be 50 ducats for each of you if you succeed in this job, he said, and the soldiers looked excited. You are to follow the Lady Eslanda morning, noon, and night. You understand me? She must not know you are following her. You will wait for a moment when she is quite alone, so that you can kidnap her without anyone hearing or seeing anything. If she escapes, or if you are seen, I shall deny that I ever gave you this order and put you to death. What do we do with her once we've got her? Asked one of the soldiers, who no longer looked excited but very scared. Said Spittleworth, turning to look out of the window while he considered what best to do with Eslanda. Well, a lady of the court isn't the same as a butcher. The Ickabog can't enter the palace and eat her. No, I think it best, said Spittleworth, a slow smile spreading over his crafty face, if you take Lady Eslanda to my estate in the country. Send word when you've got her there, and I'll join you. Chapter 35, Lord Spittleworth's Proposal. A few days later, Lady Islanda was walking alone in the palace rose garden when the two soldiers, hiding in a bush, spotted their chance. They seized her, gagged her, bound her hands, and drove her away to Spittleworth's estate in the country. Then they sent a message to Spittleworth and waited for him to join them. Spittleworth promptly summoned Lady Islanda's maid, Millicent. By threatening to murder Millicent's little sister, he forced her to deliver messages to all Lady Islanda's friends, telling them that her mistress had decided to become a nun. Lady Islanda's friends were all shocked by this news. She'd never mentioned wanting to become a nun to any of them. In fact, several of them were suspicious that Lord Spittleworth had had something to do with her sudden disappearance. However, I'm sad to tell you that Spittleworth was now so widely feared that apart from whispering their suspicions to one another, Islanda's friends did nothing to either find her or ask Spittleworth what he knew. Perhaps even worse was the fact that none of them tried to help Millicent, who was caught by soldiers trying to flee the city within the city and imprisoned in the dungeons. Next, Spittleworth had set out for his country estate, where he arrived late the following evening, after giving each of Islanda's kidnappers 50 ducats and reminding them that if they talked, he'd have them executed. Spittleworth smoothed his thin mustache in a mirror, then went to find Lady Islanda, who was sitting in a rather dusty library reading a book by candlelight. "Good evening, my lady," said Spittleworth, sweeping her a bow. Lady Islanda looked at him in silence. "I have good news for you," continued Spittleworth, smiling. "You are to become the wife of the chief advisor." "I'd sooner die," said Lady Islanda. Let me try that again, because she says it pleasantly. "I'd sooner die," said Lady Islanda pleasantly, and turning a page in her book, she continued to read. Come, come," said Spittleworth. "As you can see, my house really needs a woman's tender care. You'll be far happier here making yourself useful than pining over the cheesemaker's son, who, in any case, is likely to starve to death any day now." Lady Islanda, who had expected Spittleworth to mention Captain Goodfellow, had been preparing for this moment ever since arriving in the cold and dirty house. So she said, with neither a blush nor a tear, "I stopped caring for Captain Goodfellow a long time ago, Lord Spittleworth. The sight of him confessing a treason disgusted me. I could never love a treacherous man, which is why I could never love you." She said it so convincingly that Spittleworth believed her. He tried a different threat and told her he'd kill her parents if she didn't marry him. But Lady Islanda reminded him that she, like Captain Goodfellow, was an orphan. Then Spittleworth said he'd take away all the jewelry her mother had left her, but she shrugged and said she preferred books anyway. Finally, Spittleworth threatened to kill her, and Lady Islanda suggested he get on with it, because that would be far better than listening to him talk. Spittleworth was enraged. He'd become used to having his own way in everything, and there was something he could not have, and it only made him want it all the more. Finally, he said if she liked books so much, he'd lock her up inside the library forever. He'd have bars fitted on all the windows, and Scrumble, the butler, would bring her food 3 times a day. But she would only ever leave the room to go to the bathroom, unless she agreed to marry him. "Then I shall die in this room," said Lady Islanda calmly. "Or perhaps, who knows, in the bathroom." As he couldn't get another word out of her, the furious chief advisor left. Chapter 36, Cornucopia Hungry. A year passed, then 2, then 3, 4, and 5. Do you hear that, kids? 5 years has passed. The tiny kingdom of Cornucopia, which had once been the envy of its neighbors for its magically rich soil, for the skill of its cheesemakers, winemakers, and pastry chefs, and for the happiness of its people, had changed almost beyond recognition. True, Chauville was carrying on more or less as it always had. Spittleworth didn't want the king to notice that anything had changed, so he spent plenty of gold in the capital to keep things running as they always had, especially in the city within the city. Up in the northern cities, though, people were struggling. More and more businesses, shop taverns, blacksmiths, wheelwrights, farms, and vineyards were closing down. The Ickabog tax was pushing people into poverty. And, as if that wasn't bad enough, everyone feared being the next to receive a visit from the Ickabog, or whatever it was that broke down doors and left monster-like tracks around houses and farms. People who voiced doubts about whether the Ickabog was really behind these attacks were usually next to receive a visit from the Dark Footers. That was the name Spittleworth and Roach had given to the squad of men who murdered unbelievers in the night, leaving footprints around their victims' houses. Man, for a kid's book, there's a lot of murder in this book. Occasionally, though, the Ickabog doubters lived in the middle of a city, where it was difficult to fake an attack without the neighbor seeing. In this case, Spittleworth would hold a trial, and by threatening their families, as he had with Goodfellow and his friends, he made the accused agree that they had committed treason. Increasing numbers of trials meant Spittleworth had to oversee the building of more jails. He also needed more orphanages. Why did he need more orphanages, you ask? Well, in the first place, quite a number of parents were being killed or imprisoned. As everyone was now finding it difficult to feed their own families, they were not able to take in the abandoned children. In the second place, poor people were dying of hunger, as parents usually fed their children rather than themselves. Children were often the last of the family left alive. Why would they take care of their children first? Just kidding. And in the third place, some heartbroken, homeless families were giving up their children to orphanages because it was the only way they could make sure their children would have food and shelter. I wonder whether you remember the palace maid, Hetty, who so bravely warned Lady Aslanda that Captain Goodfellow and his friends were about to be executed. Well, Hetty used Lady Aslanda's gold to take a coach home to her father's vineyard just outside Jeroboam. A year later, she married a man called Hopkins and gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. However, the effort of paying the Ickabog tax was too much for the Hopkins family. They lost their little grocery store, and Hetty's parents couldn't help them because shortly after losing their vineyard, they'd starve to death. Homeless now, their children crying with hunger, Hetty and her husband walked in desperation to Ma Grunter's orphanage. The twins were torn, sobbing from their mother's arms. The door slammed, the bolts banged home, and poor Hetty Hopkins and her husband walked away, crying no less hard than their children and praying that Ma Grunter would keep them alive. Chapter 37. Daisy and the Moon. Ma Grunter's orphanage had changed a great deal since Daisy Dovetail had been taken there in a sack. Remember, 5 years has passed. The broken down hovel was now an enormous stone building with bars on the windows, locks on every door, and space for 100 children. Daisy was still there, grown much taller and thinner, but still wearing the coveralls in which she'd been kidnapped. She'd sewn lengths onto the arms and legs so they still fit, and patched them carefully when they tore. They were the last thing she had on her home and her father, and so she kept wearing them. Instead, I think I may have read something wrong. They were the last thing she had of her home and her father, so she kept wearing them instead of making herself dresses out of the sacks the cabbages came in, and Martha and the other girls did. Daisy had held on to the idea that her father was still alive for several long years after the kidnap. She was a clever girl and had always known her father did not believe in the Ickabog, so she forced herself to believe that he was in a cell somewhere, looking up through the barred windows at the same moon she watched every night before she fell asleep. Then one night, in her 6th year at Ma Grunter's, after tucking the Hopkins twins in for the night and promising them they'd see their mommy and daddy again soon, Daisy lay down beside Martha and looked up at the pale gold disk in the sky as usual and realized she no longer believed her father was alive. The hope had left her heart like a bird fleeing a ransacked nest. And though tears leaked out of her eyes, she told herself that her father was in a better place now, up there in the glorious heavens with her mother. She tried to find comfort in the idea that, being no longer earthbound, her parents could live anywhere, including in her own heart, and that she must keep their memories alive inside her like a flame. Still, it was hard to have parents who lived inside you when all you really wanted was for them to come back and hug you. Unlike many of the orphanage children, Daisy retained a clear memory of her parents. The memory of their love sustained her, and every day she helped look after the little ones in the orphanage and made sure they had the hugs and kisses she was missing herself. Yet it wasn't only the thought of her mother and father that enabled Daisy to carry on. She had a strange feeling that she was meant to do something important, something that would change not only her own life, but the fortunes of Cornucopia. She never told anyone about this strange feeling, not even her best friend Martha. After all, who'd believe that a penniless girl locked up in an orphanage could save the country? Yet the strange belief burned stubbornly inside her, like a flame that refused to go out. And there we shall stop for today. Chapter 38 is next. It's called Lord Spittleworth Comes to Call. Adios.